Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Becca Cantor, Jewish Book Council's editorial director, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for the launch of the 8th issue of our annual literary journal, Paper Brigade. Paper Brigade celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today. Our new issue focuses on a theme that has been at the forefront of many of our minds this year, the idea of home and homeland. Today, you'll get a taste of the ways in which our contributors explore this theme as they present their artwork or read from their pieces. They include poems, short stories, essays, and interviews. Their work is fantastic, and I'm so honored and excited to share it with you. Throughout the event, I'll be joined by different members of JBC's editorial team, and we'll take turns introducing the writers and artists speaking. In the chat, we'll be sharing each contributor's full bio. We suggest setting your view as side-by-side speaker view so that you can see the contributors and the slides at the same time. At any point, please feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to congratulate the contributors. We've also posted a link to purchase Paper Brigade, and just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code LAUNCH2025. So with that, the first contributor I'll ask to speak is Sammy Harkham, who created the cover art for this issue. Sammy, your illustration perfectly embodies the idea of home to me, and I'm struck by the way that you embedded these clues to indicate that this is a Jewish home in particular. How did you come up with these details?
Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the prompt, first of all, just to be asked to contribute was an honor and something that was really exciting, because, this year's been tough and my work has always had a lot of Jewish content in it. But to be asked by a magazine where that's like really forefronted was really nice because for the most part, even though my work has always had a spiritual dimension and a very uh very Jewish, there's always a lot of Jewish themes and work and ideas in my stuff. It's never maybe explicit or it's never trying to convey a message or clear message. I try to make the work interesting on multiple layers. Um, so it was a great opportunity. And you and I talked about it, and we wanted to highlight the idea of reading or books. And for me, when I think of like the best instances of reading, it's Shabbat. Like I used to be Shomer Shabbat, and my favorite time, even when I wasn't Shomer Shabbat as a kid, growing up in a Sephardic household, you're if you have a Sephardic parent, especially a Sephardic father, they usually feel more uh they think they're more religious than any rabbi. They have a lot of rules, even if they're not necessarily like observant, they have a lot of rules. So I grew up in a house where Shabbat was kind of a big deal. And I always just think of having, a 6 foot high stack of books and magazines and comics to go through. And that was always my favorite, like reading memory is just hours and hours of reading on Saturday. So that's where my head went. And as I worked on it and showed you sketches, it evolved and it developed. And then you start thinking about like reading, the pleasure of reading makes me think of peace, makes me think of Shabbat, makes me think of like, what does peace even mean? And then also Shabbat is an ending. So, the idea of like a horizon line and a sunset, knowing that this moment of peace is limited, but it's also cyclical. It's going to come around again. And there's just that whole like spoke on a wheel aspect of human existence, of whatever you're going through, whether it's good or bad, will come to an end. And but it's, nothing that you're in is ever going to last, whether that's good or bad. So all those ideas were sort of at play as we developed it, you know.
Thank you so much, Sammy. That's so fascinating and profound to hear about all of the thoughts and background that went into producing this stunning image. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it was fun. And it was, as the drawing develops, more and more ideas start coming into it just naturally. So, it was like once you have to start figuring out like what's the architecture of it, you start thinking of like, well, it's Los Angeles because it was personal to me and I'm in LA. You start thinking of Spanish colonial architecture, revival architecture, um, and then connecting those ideas with, my Iraqi background, and there were just ways where I just felt like, oh, there's all these corollaries where hopefully someone who, the longer they look at it, hopefully it just works as a cover, but the more they look at it, the more they're picking up on various ideas and themes, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely true for me. So yes, thank you again. And I think one of the things that we had spoken about too is that home has often been an elusive ideal, rather than a reality for Jewish people. Many of our contributors write about the feeling of being caught between two worlds and not fully belonging to either of them. Next, we have the Jewish literary map in this issue, which is beautifully illustrated by Catherine Messenger. This year, the map is of the Netherlands. Over the course of its history, the Netherlands has been both a haven and a mire for Jews. Our next speakers will be Nina Siegel and Yael van der Wouden, both of whom have written books that shed light on overlooked Dutch World War II stories. Yael and Nina, as you discuss in your interview, The Diary Beyond Anne Frank, both of you grew up outside the Netherlands, and the anti-Semitism in the country came as something of a shock when you actually moved there. Yael, I wonder if you could explain how your own experience of anti-Semitism informed your book, The Safe Keep. Would it be fair to call the book, in some sense, a rebuttal of the common Dutch narrative of World War II?
I that's
Big question, sorry.
no, it's, I mean, I think that's such a terrible thing to say. It's up to the reader, really. I mean, all I can say is that me writing the book is me trying to figure things out, having a conversation with myself about big frustrations and big questions, and also small questions that I had for myself about my own emotions about living here, which have to do a lot with being both invisible and hyper visible at the same time. Invisible in the sense that your culture is invisible. It is not part of the mainstream conversation. It's not part of the national schedule, let's say, right? There's no, the holidays do not exist in the public mind. Rituals, traditions, and yet the language is, that is to say, Yiddish, is completely interwoven into contemporary Dutch, and certain traditions have filtered through into Dutch traditions, like eating matzahs with Easter. And
Oh,
additionally, certain Jewish archetypes and famous people, let's say, throughout history are known and are discussed. And so there's this, and if you like I was, when I was 13, if you resemble one of those people, I looked a little bit like Anne Frank when I was 13, which is that was my position at school. That was who I was. I was the one Jewish girl who looked like Anne Frank. And that was how a lot of the kids interacted with me at the time. That was what I was called. And so there's this hypervisibility in who you represent, and then this complete invisibility in who you are. And that's where the book came from. I wanted to investigate that, and I wanted to investigate the question of, does living in a place with the history that the Netherlands has, does that also imply complicity, perpetratorship, and on the flip side, sort of what are the different shades of victimhood? And I wanted to complicate my own vision of it.
Thank you so much, Yael. That is so interesting and so powerful. I really appreciate it. So, The Safekeep and Nina, your book, The Diary Keepers, both address the idea of physical spaces, especially homes, as repositories for memory. Nina, you had written that it wasn't until you were physically in Amsterdam, living in an apartment that resembled Anne Frank's annex, that you truly felt the weight of the Holocaust on your family history and decided to research the Holocaust. Could you explain how that came about?
Sure. So actually, I moved to Amsterdam to write about Rembrandt for a novel that I was working on in 2006. And I ended up living, well, Rembrandt used to live in the old Jewish quarter, which now is called the Joden, which is the Jewish Broadway, basically. And so I wanted to be near where he was located. And so I got my first apartment in an attic of a very narrow Dutch building where you had to walk up 4 flights of stairs and then actually through another little hatch you had to push up the door to get into the apartment. And it was funny because I joke with Yael when I was interviewing her for another piece about how I was the Jew in the attic and she also lives in an attic space. And David Sedaris actually has a very funny story about looking for real estate in Paris and then coming to Amsterdam and going to the Anne Frank house and thinking about it as like property. I don't know if you guys know that story. It's such a striking critique. But so I was very conscious of that. And then of course, in spending a lot of time in the Jewish quarter, I recognized a different story that I had not been aware of, which was that basically 75% of the Dutch Jewish population had been murdered in the Holocaust. But this is not the impression that I had had as an American growing up, reading Anne Frank and learning about, people who hid Jews in these spectacular ways. And what I felt more than anything else was this sort of haunting, this absence. And as I, went through these old synagogues that had been turned into museums and into a former Jewish theater that had been turned into a memorial site, and it just felt like everything was empty, And I mean, since I've been living here 18 years, and since then I have found a Jewish community, I connect with people, but you really are aware. I mean, you could talk about pickles or you could talk about challah and like things that people know in this country, except that they like the part of the Jewish culture that really made it like tasty is really not there anymore. It's really hard because you feel, and people here too are aware that some part of the foundation of Amsterdam culture specifically, which used to be, somewhere between 10 and 14% Jewish, was very culturally Jewish, in the way that New York feels culturally Jewish almost, but that presence is not very often acknowledged and also not often honored, certainly not very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. That again is so fascinating and so evocative. I'm going to hand it over now to Carol Kaufman, GBC's executive editor, who will introduce the next speakers.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carol. Just a minute. Thanks so much, Becca. Our next speaker is Basia Wino. Basia's short story, Our Aunt of the West, is told from the point of view of Max, a young teenager in Soviet Poland in the 1960s. A visit from Max's Aunt Estera, who lives in Italy, makes him question his ideas about home and Jewish identity. As this scene opens, Aunt Estera is about to arrive in Warsaw. Basia.
Thank you so much for that, Carol, and thank you to everyone at Paper Brigade for having me again. It's such a treat. I crawled into bed, wondering about the woman who had inspired such a frenzy of housekeeping in my mother. What really did I know about my aunt, Estera Hasman Buletti? That she lived in a fairy tale land known as Milano? That we had her to thank for the designer blue jeans my brothers and I flaunted on the streets of Warsaw, while scratchy Soviet imitations bunched at the crotches of our less fortunate friends? That she made possible Pani Michalowska, our moist-eyed piano teacher, and the succession of college students who appeared at our home claiming to be fluent in English. And that it was she who provided funds to ensure a happy solution when the authorities came sniffing around, wondering at our apartment's pre-war grandeur, what with Tata still resolutely refusing to join the party. When Aunt Estera breezed into our apartment the following morning in her white mink coat and matching hat, the first thing she said was, "Well, Felix, I see you haven't done the world the favor of getting rid of this ghastly cabinet." She tapped the gleaming surface of Mama's favorite credenza with the tip of a gloved finger. Tata backed into the apartment behind her, dragging her suitcases. "What have you got in here?" he huffed. "Bricks?" "Culture, Felix, culture. You wouldn't understand." Aunt dropped her leather gloves on the credenza. She stepped back to consider the birds and squirrels etched into its teak doors. If she noticed the photograph of herself that Mama had placed there, she said nothing of it. Mama had been waiting at the window all morning, and when she'd seen Tata's Trabant pull up in front of the building, she'd rushed to line up my brothers and me in the foyer. Now she hovered behind us as we greeted our Aunt Estera, dutifully kissing her cool, pale cheeks and asking how her flight had been. "Perfectly fine, thank you very much," she assured us, and cut off the rest of the questions Mama had scripted by dropping her coat and hat into Tata's arms and making her way, uninvited, into the salon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basia. That scene is so vivid. Everyone's uncomfortable. Our next speaker will be Katya Apekina, the author of Mother Doll. Katya writes from the perspective of someone who has left a communist country. Katya, please read an excerpt of your essay for Soviet Stories that captures how intergenerational trauma from this experience has persisted in your family, even though you've lived in the US for decades.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to read from my essay. After my daughter was born, I found myself thinking about what I was passing down to her. My weird sense of humor, my soft teeth, my delight in eavesdropping, my curiosity about other people's stories. I also began to think about what had been passed down to me. Were there aspects of myself that I saw as my own, but were in fact stowaway traits from my ancestors? Seeing my daughter grow has inspired me to explore my own story. When she turned 3, I was brought back to my experience at that age of immigrating with my mother and her parents from the USSR to America. It was 1986. My grandfather was dying and needed open heart surgery, something he could only get in the United States. My grandparents were refuseniks, denied permission to leave the Soviet Union, and fired from their jobs as marine biologists. My mother and grandmother went on a hunger strike, and eventually my mother, her parents, and I were able to leave. My father wasn't. In Boston, I learned English and assimilated as best I could, but I was filled with uncertainty, not knowing if I'd ever see my father again, and not remembering what he looked like anymore. It felt endless, but within a year he arrived. Growing up, I would not have described the immigration or the severance within my family as traumatic, but having a daughter that age made it easier for me to finally acknowledge and process those difficult feelings. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya. Our next contributor is Josh Rolnick, the fiction editor of Paper Brigade. Josh, in your story Kindertransport, Hannah, a woman whose family has lived in Vienna for generations, is suddenly at risk after the Nazis annex Austria. She faces the agonizing decision of whether to send her 7-year-old daughter, Emma, away from Vienna on the Kindertransport or to keep Emma with her in Vienna. Josh, could you please read the passage when Hannah brings Emma to the train station?
Sure, Carol. Thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, this scene takes place towards the end of the story, and the mother Hannah has been trying desperately to find a way to get her daughter out of the city, and their father has already been killed. On the platform, Hannah feels her body sway. She's envisioned this moment, a railway station parting, more times than she can count. She believed in it when it hadn't seemed possible. She expected to feel relief. Instead, she feels something much closer to dread. Still, she urges her daughter forward, a slight pressure against the delicate wing of her shoulder. "It's time, Emma," she says. Emma closes her lips and looks from her mother to the train, then lifts her case, squares her shoulders, begins to walk. Hannah tries to help her at the grip step, reaching for her elbow, but Emma twists away. "I've got it," she says, grunting as she climbs up the stairs, depositing her suitcase on a wooden rack in the stow at the front of the car. To the left, Hannah points, checking the paper ticket. 12B. Hannah moves ahead of her up the aisle, touching seat backs as she goes, counting up until she finds her row. "You've got the window seat," Hannah says. "I like the window," says Emma, quietly, settling herself on the cushion. "You'll remember to write," Hannah says. "Yes, Mama, I'll remember. Every week. You must write to me every week." "I promise," Emma says. "I'll write you a letter a week." "You'll remember to eat your sandwiches?" "Yes, Mama, I'll eat my sandwiches." 2 minutes, the conductor says from the vestibule at the front of the car before vanishing into the shadows. "Well, okay then," she says, leaning forward, giving her daughter a final kiss on the forehead, tasting hair, the sweetness of her skin. "I love you and I'll see you, okay? I love you and I'll see you." Her daughter nods. "I love you too." And then Hannah is upright again. Frau Lefferts warned her not to linger. These partings are hard enough without dallying. Moving quickly, back down the aisle between the seats, into the vestibule, down 3 steps to the stone platform, where, with a violence that wants to crumple her at the knees, she thinks, "I've made a terrible mistake."
Thank you so much, Josh. What a poignant scene.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn it over to Simona Zaretsky now, JBC's managing editor of digital content and marketing, who will introduce the next speakers.
Thank you so much, Carol. We would now like to explore the search for home as it relates to Israel. In their interview, Words Between Worlds, Yael and Maya Arad describe navigating between different languages and identities as Israeli authors abroad. Maya, as Ron and Omer Sherman notes in his interview with you, your novella, The Hebrew Teacher, focuses on a professor, Ilana, who has endless enthusiasm for immersing her students in Israeli culture. But after 40 years, she remains an adjunct and her colleagues are moving ahead with the hire of her least favorite candidate, the anti-Zionist Yael. Ranan asks, is anti-Zionism something you see transforming the nature of Jewish and Hebrew studies?
Right. So actually, I wasn't thinking of anybody in particular or of any Hebrew teacher, after the story came out, both in Hebrew and then later on in March this year in English with the wonderful translation of Jessica Cohen. People came up to me and they said, "You wrote about me," or "I know who Yoad is," or "You wrote about our Hebrew teacher." But no, I really, I was thinking about Ilana. I could write about her as a Hebrew author being so far away from Israel. We're both Israeli women making a living off Hebrew this way or other, so I could really relate to her. And the story, The Hebrew Teacher, was originally written in 2015, not long after Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. And I remember on October 7, the book, the English translation was already in production. And I remember thinking for a moment, wow, this story has become completely irrelevant because the words war in Gaza had taken on such a horrific new meaning. But in fact, the opposite happened. People find the story more relevant than ever to the current experience on college campuses. You know, perhaps literature has a way of being prescient, and I think many of us share Ilana's shock of no longer having even a minimal shared worldview with the people on the far left. At least for some of the year, we felt this way. But I also try to capture something more complex than just a political and ideological battle between, you know, two sides or two generations. Actually, Ilana and Yoad represent two generations, right? The older generation that's very protective of Israel, and if they have any criticism, they, you know, keep it within Israel, not being very vocal about it. So the story is told from Ilana's point of view, which is very Zionist and very pro-Israel, but we see moments when she agrees with Yoad on certain issues, and also moments when she is portrayed with a touch of irony. And we know that the world is complex, and sometimes the Yoads of this world have valid points, and sometimes the Ilanas do. And I think most of us have both Ilana and Yoad struggling inside us. And when I say most of us, I think specifically Israeli expats, especially in academia. We find ourselves oscillating between anger toward the American far left and anger toward the Israeli government, with the one constant being is the love of Hebrew language and culture that we all share. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think this is Yoad's fatal flaw. He doesn't care about Hebrew literature. It's not the anti-Zionism, it's not caring about literature.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that insightful response. Our next speaker is Yael Sabari, whose recent novel, Songs for the Brokenhearted, follows 4 different Yemeni Israeli protagonists that are all, in a sense, searching for a place in a country to belong in. Yael unfortunately couldn't join us today, but she sent in a video of herself discussing the character's quest for home.
My own sense of belonging has been fractured since childhood, partially because of my Yemeni heritage, partially because losing my father when I was very young. Because of this, I find myself endlessly investigating the myriad reasons other people also struggle to find a sense of belonging. Yoni feels adjacent to the new family his mother has created and does not even feel entirely at home in his growing teenage body. Zohara grew distance from her heritage, her neighborhood, and her family. Yaqub tries to reconcile the fantasy of the Holy Land he yearned for as a Yemeni Jew with the reality of Israel. As an Israeli and a Jew, I'm interested in the idea of home not only on a personal level, but also on a historical level. The question of belonging in the novel is related to Mizrahi identity and to the wish, and often failure, to fit into an Israeli society that idealizes European Ashkenazi culture. Nowadays, discussions about home in relation to this region have become flattened, one-dimensional, and combative. But the beauty of fiction is that it allows for nuance. If I had to characterize Jewish literature, I'd say that the search for belonging is a common thematic thread.
So much to Yael. In recent years, nothing has made us question the possibility of a peaceful Jewish existence like Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. Days after the attack, JBC began a new online series, Witnessing, which shares pieces from Israeli authors in Israel, and the experiences of Jewish writers around the globe in the aftermath of October 7th. This issue of Paper Brigade includes 4 pieces from the Witnessing series, including Just Like the Soul Returns to the Body by Yaara She, Sestina 9 Months by Rachel Savit, We Are No Longer Welcome by Yardine Greenspan, and All of Us Sitting on That Bench by Gula Gertz. I encourage you to read these and more pieces from the Witnessing series, which you can find at the link in the chat. And now, Becca, handing it over to you.
Thanks so much, Simona. In its ideal form, home means safety. A number of our contributors show home as a place where one has the freedom to be vulnerable, to come into one's creativity, sexuality, and personhood. This aspect of home is beautifully evoked in Razel Grace's poem, Still Life of My Apartment on a Winter Morning. Razel, could you read your poem, please?
I'd be happy to, and thank you so much for having me. Still Life of My Apartment on a Winter Morning, for Yaara She. When I wake, the flowers you left on the kitchen table kiss me. No one gave me flowers before that night, before I took you to the Klezmer Festival. And I don't know if you knew that the White Rose was a resistance group that took its name from a banned book. I only know how much you love that I am a librarian, and a Jew, and me. When I wake, February's air is silent outside the window of my apartment, but I am not there. I am in a cottage in a fairy tale, with songbirds laying out dresses and admiring my vase. Oh, but these are German stories, filled with blonde Herzoginen and typologies of Christ. Still, I love them. You know I do. You know the deer that gather at the window. You have sent them from the brush of Mark Davis, who drew Dalmatians after adapting Zalton. They nuzzle my hands, dote on my voice, lick up the scent of roses and Shabbos wine as though the latches were broken on the gates of both the castle's garden and the ghetto's vineyard. I shoo away the songbirds like they are still carrying on the Sabbath, make my dress of nothing but petals. Who could imagine it but you? You have seen every rotoscope layer of my cells. You know with what unsteady lines ink traces photo, home traces exile, story traces story, one body traces another. And still, you brought me roses.
Thank you so much, Razel. That is absolutely lovely. In her gorgeous debut novel, Sirens and Muses, Antonia Angress depicts the relationship between Karina and Louisa, two queer art students and roommates. Antonia, in the past, you've spoken about how your idea of home is influenced by the fact that your grandparents were Holocaust refugees. Does that legacy of migration also influence the Jewish characters in your novel?
Yeah, my work in general is preoccupied with belonging and home, and what it means to live in a place, to put down roots in a place, or to leave. And that certainly has its origins in my own family's history of expulsion and migration, but also in my own experience growing up in Costa Rica, a country where my parents were foreigners, but where I largely could pass as local unless I told people that I wasn't. So I felt like I existed between worlds. And even though I've lived in the US my entire adult life, there are still ways in which I feel like an outsider. There are still things that bring up flickers of culture shock. In Sirens and Muses, Karina's great-grandparents were art collectors and they lost their collection to the Nazis. So there's this sense in which the Holocaust lurks in the background, in the texture of her upbringing.
And how does the relationship between Karina and Louisa subvert what we might think of as the traditional relationship between an artist and a muse?
So in the popular imagination, I think the muse is a passive figure. She, and I feel like the muse is almost always a she, provides the inspiration. She's literally an object. She's the object of the artist's gaze. So we have this prescribed narrative of what this heterosexual dynamic between the artist and the muse is supposed to look like. And if you're in a heterosexual artist-muse relationship, it's easy to fall into a role that's already been written for you. But one of the things that I wanted to do with the relationship between Luis and Karina was to untether the muse-artist relationship from the male gaze. And in the dynamic between these two women, there's much less of a prescribed narrative. There's much more freedom, much more negotiation of power dynamics. There's more reciprocity.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was absolutely fascinating, as is the book itself. I'll now hand it over to Kira Liss, our associate editor.
Thank you so much, Becca. Our next speaker will be Barak Kas, the author of The Roman Palms. This short story lured us in with its distinctive narrative voice and its depiction of an earnest search for connection in a seemingly inhospitable home. Barak, I'd love to hear you read from your story.
Thanks, Kira. I am not the only gig worker in the Palms. Probably a third of the tenants drive for Lyft, Uber, DoorDash. Me, I'm a mezuzah scribe. In Hebrew, the word is sofer, same as the word for author. Weird, given that authors create and I just grind. 6 days a week, I copy words on small squares of parchment with a goose quill. Medieval. Today, the Palms, officially it's called the Roman Palms, feels like it could melt into a sick mix of sweat and curtains, wall-to-wall carpeting, and clumps of hair in the drains, and then evaporate into something like the rusty smog suffocating Los Angeles. The last day I remember being this hot was in Tzfat, when my dad called with the news. The narrow street outside the Institute looked oily with heat. The sky was a pale orange, just like it is today, and the air smelled of gasoline. I was 18. Haleli had just left for the army. My walks around the building keep me sane. They counteract the crumbling of my spine and my spirit. Scroll, walk, or as Jose says, scroll, stroll. Ha. He's the best part of the walks, the one person I talk to for real, but I like seeing the other tenants too. I like the waves, the nods, what Jose calls my little talk with them. Mrs. Carreas in 214, a few doors down from me, waves from a patio chair outside her unit on my morning walk. She's kind of elegant for the Palms, and her dog, a regal Chihuahua, Jose calls him Very Little Prince, yips and then is quiet as soon as he recognizes me. I bend and pat him on the head, smiling up at Mrs. Carreas. She is getting frailer and has missed a few waves in recent days. Her granddaughter, Ara, recently moved in to help her. She drives for Uber. Jose told me this. I've not spoken with Ara. We just nod. She reminds me of Haleli with her dark hair and eyes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barak. That gives us such a wonderful taste of the story.
Thank you.
We will now have a virtual studio visit with Jenny Kroik, the artist who made the stunning illustration for the Roman Palms.
Hi everybody, my name is Jenny Kroik and this is my studio. Welcome. I am a painter and an illustrator. I have created a few illustrations for Paper Brigade, and today I want to show you how I create an illustration from start to finish. So yeah, let's start.
I usually start by reading the text, and then I see if there's anything that jumps out from the text, like images or something that sparks a visual that I can use. Then I work up some more detailed sketches to send to the art director or editor to look at. I edit these sketches so that they look a little bit more presentable, and then I'll add some notes as well sometimes. After a sketch is approved, I'll start gathering some reference materials. I'll do some research on anything that is related to the text. And sometimes I'll even use myself and my husband or anyone that's around be reference for the final painting. And then finally I'll start working on the painting, and this is the fun part but also the slow part. It requires a lot of layers and patience, but finally it all comes together. This story I was illustrating, Roman Palms by Barak Kas, featured a mezuzah scribe, which was really interesting because I was drawing some of the letters and doing what the character in the story was doing. So that was actually kind of an interesting way to tie in and feel connected to the illustration that I was working on and the story. As an illustrator, I really enjoy working on all these various stories for the Jewish Book Council and Paper Brigade, and sort of thinking about the themes in Judaism and working on them in paint is super interesting to me. And the best part is seeing everything in print at the end. It's really enjoyable for me. Thank you so much, and see you again soon.
That was so cool. So we have another visual treat in store for you, Richard Ho's picture book, 2 New Years. Like the Roman Palms, Two New Years focuses on embracing different cultures and traditions. Richard, I'd love to hear you read from your author's note, and as you do so, we'll show some of the beautiful images that are excerpted in Paper Brigade.
Thank you so much, Kira, and thank you, JBC, for having me. My kids are so lucky. Born Chinese and Jewish, they get to grow up with the best of two worlds. Two cultures with long histories and beautiful traditions that intersect in so many ways. Two sides of a family that extend across the globe, yet always come together for celebrations. I converted to Judaism as an adult. For me, the blending of two cultures was a conscious choice. I cherished the traditional Chinese upbringing I received from my parents, and at the same time, I fully embraced the beliefs and rituals of Jewish life. I never dreamed of abandoning one culture for the other. Both can and should coexist. Still, I was nervous at the beginning. Would these two lifestyles clash? Would I find myself drifting away from one in favor of the other? Would I be forced to choose between them? Thankfully, the Chinese and Jewish aspects of my life turned out to be more aligned than I ever could have hoped. Yes, the customs and symbols of each tradition are very different, but the ideals that they represent, family, community, hope, and renewal, are universal. And nowhere is that harmony more apparent than in how both cultures welcome the new year.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Richard. Next, I'm thrilled to introduce our final contributor speaking today, Josh Logue. Josh's poem, Here I Am, draws on the biblical Akedah to imagine a distant Jewish future in which the speaker is still searching for connection. Equally funny and sobering, the poem collapses so much time and space into one snappy, transfixing vignette. Josh, we would be honored to hear you read from the poem.
Thank you, Kira. This is called Here I Am. Hard to say exactly when this happened, but it was a while ago that God called to Abraham, and Abraham responded, Here I am. And there's a good chance you know how the story goes from here. Abraham took his son up to a mountain and raised his knife heavenward. But before things got too out of hand, God sent an angel who again called to Abraham, who again responded, Here I am. Now, I'm not going to say this is the same thing as that, but 30-ish thousand years later, the last Jew in the universe gets totally bulldozed by a malfunctioning lunar automaton. Winded, leg broken, lying in the silicate shale dust of one of Kepler 296e's nameless moons, designation KOI 1422.05, Akiva, the last living Jew, fogs up his visor with shallow, ragged gasps, trying to catch his breath. I don't want to get into the whole last living Jew thing too much. 30,000 years is a long time and things happen. But I guess my point is, Akiva isn't thinking about Isaac as he lies there waiting for the medical drone. He's wondering as he gazes up past the barely there atmosphere into the eternal cosmic void, what in his psychometric profile could have possibly suggested aptitude for a job as lonely as this. And as he's staring at the million billion pinprick stars and galaxies, one dot seems to grow brighter, flickering in the black, and Akiva can't tell if he's imagining the voice that emanates forth, calling to him across time and space, but still he responds, Here I am.
Thank you so much for reading, Josh. I really love that. And now it's my privilege to hand it back over to Becca.
Thank you so much, Kira. And thank you again to all of our contributors and everyone in the audience who has joined us today. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. Especially today, with the rise of anti-Semitism in publishing and just at large, we're dedicated to providing a home for Jewish writing and authors. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is crucial to our initiatives. I'd like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. If you're intrigued by what you've heard and seen today, and you'd like to read more by our contributors, we're posting the link to purchase Paper Brigade and the discount code again in the chat. I also want to note that our submission period for short stories and poetry will be opening very soon, so please just keep an eye out for that announcement on social media and on our newsletter. With that, I'd like to invite all of our contributors and editors to the screen for a final thank you. Contributors, your words and art are a true inspiration. Thank you so much for letting us feature your work. Thank you to our fantastic fiction readers and to Paper Brigade's enormously talented designer, Alex Lesberg. Lastly, I'd like to thank my wonderful colleagues at Jewish Book Council. Everything here is truly a team effort, and Paper Brigade would definitely not be what it is without you. If you're a JBC member joining us for the Q&A with the editors, we'll see you in a separate Zoom meeting momentarily. And I hope that all of you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you again for joining us.